Keep your mouth shut and just pour the coffee. No one here cares what you think." The words fell like a slap across the room, silencing the clatter of silverware and freezing the hum of small talk. Heads turned toward the table where a man in an expensive suit lounged, his wrist heavy with gold, his smirk sharper than the knife at his plate. He leaned back with an air of untouchable arrogance, the kind only money or power can buy, and let his insult hang for everyone to hear. Across from him stood the waitress, a young black woman in a crisp uniform, her notepad in hand. Her posture was straight, her voice unshaken, her presence quiet but firm. She did not snap back, did not flinch, did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. To him, and to many watching, she was invisible, just another server carrying plates and clearing glasses. But her silence carried more weight than the room realized. The man chuckled, taking a long sip of his wine before adding, "People like you ought to be grateful you even get to serve tables like these. Beyond this room, you're nothing." A few guests laughed nervously, unsure whether to align themselves with his cruelty or look away. Some smirked into their phones, already recording the scene for later amusement. The waitress said nothing. She continued pouring, her hand steady, her eyes calm. To the arrogant man, her composure looked like submission. To others, it was something else entirely, something unsettling, as if she were quietly waiting for the exact moment to reveal herself. Then, at a nearby table, a French tourist struggled with the menu. His accent was thick, his frustration obvious as he stumbled over the words, trying to communicate his order. Before anyone could step in, the waitress leaned closer and spoke in flawless French, her tone elegant, her words flowing effortlessly. Relief spread across the tourist's face as he responded in his native tongue, smiling for the first time that evening. The room shifted. Conversations stalled. Forks hovered midair. Guests exchanged startled glances, whispers rising like sparks. The waitress, who had been dismissed as nothing more than a server, had just peeled back the curtain of their assumptions. Except for the arrogant man. He sneered, his pride pricked and scoffed loud enough for the room to hear. "Showing off. Now, are we? Doesn't matter how many fancy words you know, you'll always be just a waitress." Phones stayed raised. Eyebrows lifted. Murmurs grew, and at the table tucked quietly in the corner, a billionaire, dressed simply, observing carefully, folded his hands and watched, eyes narrowing with interest. If you believe hidden brilliance can shatter arrogance in one unforgettable moment, stay with me till the end. This story will prove it. They thought it was harmless mockery, but within moments their laughter would turn into stunned silence. She wasn't born into luxury, nor into the kind of world where second chances came easily. Her earliest memories were of a tiny apartment with walls that held more dreams than they did space. Raised by a single mother in a working-class neighborhood, she learned resilience the way some children learn lullabies. Her mother worked 2 jobs, cashier by day, cleaner by night, and still managed to tuck her in with a kiss and a whispered promise. One day, all this will mean something. The girl grew up watching her mother sacrifice, stretching every dollar, patching every torn shoe, and encouraging every ambition. If money was scarce, wisdom was abundant. And when her grandmother visited, wisdom turned into fire. The old woman, who had lived through her share of storms, gave her the mantra that would become her compass. Dignity doesn't shout. It waits, and then it roars. Those words stayed with her. They shaped how she carried herself, not with loud defiance but with a quiet strength that didn't need validation. While other kids chased after fleeting popularity, she spent her nights hunched over worn library books, tracing her fingers over unfamiliar words in French, Spanish, and Italian. She listened to foreign radio stations on crackly recordings, teaching her ears to dance with sounds that didn't belong to her neighborhood. It wasn't easy. Some nights she'd walk home from her shift at the diner, her apron still damp from spilled coffee, only to dive into her notebooks, scribbling grammar rules by hand. She worked part-time jobs just to afford the bus fare to libraries where the world opened its doors in the form of dictionaries and language tapes. She carried her studies with her everywhere, sticky notes stuffed in her pockets, translations scrawled on napkins, vocabulary lists playing through her earbuds while she wiped tables clean. Her dream was never modest. She wanted to become a translator, maybe even work for the United Nations. She pictured herself bridging worlds with words, making peace possible across languages. But life's realities had other plans. Bills had to be paid. Her mother's health faltered. Opportunities passed her by, replaced with shifts that stretched late into the night. And so, the girl who dreamed of international conferences found herself waiting tables, her brilliance hidden behind a uniform. To the customers she served, she was invisible, just another face in a crowd of servers. But beneath the surface, she carried more than menus and plates. She carried centuries of family resilience, pages of handwritten notes, and the sharp edge of a mind trained to wait for its moment. The man who mocked her that night, the wealthy guest whose voice filled the restaurant, could not have lived in a more different world. Born into privilege, he had never known what it meant to earn respect. It had been handed to him with his first breath. He flaunted his wealth in designer suits, dismissing those who worked around him as little more than background noise. Service. Staff, to him, were invisible, tools to be ordered, not people to be respected. He thrived on belittling others, feeding his ego by tearing down anyone who couldn't fight back. To his circle, arrogance was not a flaw but a sign of status. And so, when he mocked the waitress, he thought it was nothing more than entertainment, a demonstration of his power. He expected nervous laughter, submissive apologies, and maybe even applause from those who shared his disdain. What he didn't expect was silence. A silence so steady, so immovable, that it unsettled the very ground he stood on, because her silence was not a weakness. It was waiting, and waiting, after. All is the strongest roar. The laughter started as a thin ribbon and widened into a rope the antagonist kept tugging. He leaned back in his chair like a man who owned the air itself. "Pretend all you like," he said, his voice pitched to carry. "Anyone can memorize a phrase or two. Bonjour doesn't make you a bilingual Barbie. The waitress didn't." Flinch. She stood with her tray balanced against her hip, posture straight, eyes calm. To him, she looked like nothing, just a server playing dress-up. To the French tourist she had just assisted, she looked like salvation. His family smiled, grateful as she guided them through the menu with an ease he hadn't expected in this place. But the antagonist wasn't finished. He raised his glass in a mock toast. "Tell her to say something complicated," he said to the Frenchman. "Ask her about financial derivatives. Let's see her squirm." The tourist hesitated, then asked. Without missing a beat, she explained, in French, the term, the difference between derivatives and securities, and even recommended a wine pairing to complement their meal. The Frenchman blinked, then laughed in delight. His wife applauded. Softly. "Lucky guess," the antagonist muttered, but his voice lacked the iron of before. He turned to another diner. "Marco, ask her something in Spanish." Marco, reluctant, asked about allergens in the sauces. The waitress answered in smooth Spanish, explaining ingredients and cross-contamination practices. Marco nodded, grateful. The antagonist waved it off. "Parrot tricks. She's memorized lines." He wasn't ready to surrender. "All right, Italian then. Order me the rarest scotch on the list?" In Italian. The waitress's reply was flawless. She named the scotch, the age, and even described the region. From the bar, the bartender nodded in approval. A few diners clapped. Some laughed nervously, torn between admiration and fear of siding against wealth. Others shifted uncomfortably, watching the balance of the room tilt. The antagonist leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You think big words make you big? They don't. You'll always come back to this. Clearing plates for people like me." Her answer was a simple professional nod. "Would you like it neat, sir?" He grinned, mistaking her poise for surrender. "Yes, and when it comes, bring it to me on your knees." Gasps swept the room. A couple chuckled automatically, but the sound curdled in the silence that followed. Phones stayed raised, lenses catching every flicker of the moment. The manager hurried over. "Sir." "It's a joke," the antagonist snapped. If she can't take a joke, she's in the wrong job. The waitress turned back to the French family, kneeling slightly to meet the daughter's eyes as she translated, "Thank you for being kind." The little girl repeated it, giggling, and the mother mouthed merci. The kindness was louder than any insult. The antagonist, growing desperate, demanded more tests. Read from a French paper. Right now. A hostess handed her an article on her phone. She read fluently, translating passages with ease, untangling idioms with the skill of someone who understood, not just the words, but the culture behind them. Diners murmured in admiration. "Coincidence," the antagonist barked. "You're still nothing. Language is nothing without power, and you don't have it." She didn't answer. Silence fell over her like a cloak. The more she refused to play his game, the more brittle he became. The crowd split. Some laughed thinly, clinging to his authority. Others exchanged looks of unease, recognizing cruelty for what it was. From the bar, a sommelier whispered, "She's right," when she described a wine's terroir perfectly. Respect rippled. Quiet, but undeniable. "Sometimes the quiet ones surprise you," a man at the Billionaire's table murmured. The billionaire didn't reply. He only watched, eyes intent, as if he already knew where this was going. The antagonist pressed for a final blow. "Tell me," he sneered, "what does it feel like to dream of the UN and wake up wearing aprons? To speak 5 languages and still pour coffee for men who own the buildings you can't enter?" She met his gaze without malice. "Would you like cream or black with your dessert course?" A ripple of warm laughter spread, this time not at her expense but in support. The antagonist blinked, caught off guard. His performance had slipped. He reached for his glass and found his hand trembling. She returned with the scotch, on a tray, not a stage. She set it down with perfect grace. "Neat," she said softly. Then to the French tourist in his language, "The crème brûlée. Tonight is lovely, with orange zest. Highly recommended." The French family smiled. The child clapped, and the room began to shift. Phones still recorded, but faces now tilted toward her. The diners weren't watching a spectacle anymore. They were witnessing a reckoning. The antagonist lifted his scotch, but the power he thought was his had already slipped away. His laughter no longer commanded the room. His arrogance had been swallowed by her calm, by her fluency, by the dignity that never once raised its voice. And in the corner, the billionaire folded his napkin, scribbled something on paper, and slipped it under his plate with deliberate care. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that promised what the antagonist could never give: opportunity. At the center of it all, the waitress remained as she had begun, calm, composed, unbroken. But the room was no longer the same. It had learned. Her language, the quiet roar of dignity. The antagonist leaned forward, elbows pressing into the tablecloth, eyes glittering with malice. He had thrown every barb he could, yet still she stood before him, unshaken. His pride was fraying, and in desperation, he raised his voice so the entire restaurant could hear. "All right, waitress," he sneered. "Enough of these little parlor tricks. Say something impressive. If you're really as smart as you pretend, dazzle us. Prove to everyone here you're more than an apron." The demand hung in the air like a challenge, daring her to stumble. Phones tilted higher, diners leaned forward, forks suspended over half-eaten meals. Even the staff behind the bar stopped polishing glasses. The restaurant had become a theater, and the antagonist assumed himself the director of the scene. The waitress didn't answer right away. She inhaled softly, let the hush stretch just a little longer, and then, with the composure of someone born to command a stage, she began to speak. First came French. Smooth, elegant, effortless. She described the menu items in vivid detail, weaving words together so gracefully that even those who didn't understand the language felt the music in her tone. Le saumon, accompagné d'une sauce légère, aux agrumes, et une danse de fraîcheur et de saveur. The French family applauded openly, tears brimming in the mother's eyes. Without missing a beat, the waitress turned to Spanish. Her words carried warmth, rich with cadence. She explained the specials of the evening, then launched into the history of one of the wines on the list, her voice rhythmic and sure. Guests who spoke Spanish nodded, impressed by the authenticity of her accent. And then, seamlessly, she shifted to Italian. She told a proverb, her pronunciation flawless. Il rispetto è come il sole, illumina tutti senza distinzione. Respect is like the sun. It shines on everyone without distinction. The room gasped, then erupted into murmurs. Phones zoomed in, diners whispered in disbelief, and the arrogant smirk on the antagonist's face faltered. He had expected stumbles, missteps, something he could mock. Instead, he was watching himself shrink in the reflection of her brilliance. A businessman at a nearby table raised his hand timidly. "Excuse me, could you translate something into German?" She turned toward him with a small smile. "Of course." And though German was not her strongest, she recited a greeting, followed by an idiom, her voice clear, confident, enough to draw approving laughter from a German couple seated in the back. Another guest chimed in, emboldened. "Japanese. Do you know Japanese?" To their astonishment, she bowed slightly and replied with a simple introduction in Japanese, her vowels sharp and precise, her tone respectful. The applause came before she had even finished. It became a game, but one she dominated with grace. A woman asked her to explain the origins of tiramisu in Italian. She did, sprinkling in cultural notes that delighted the guests. A man asked her to recommend a wine pairing in French. She described the terroir so accurately that the sommelier himself nodded in agreement. The room shifted entirely. No longer were the diners spectators of a cruel spectacle. They had become participants in a revelation. Applause broke out again and again, rippling through the tables like thunder rolling across hills. And through it all, the antagonist sat frozen, his mouth dry, his cheeks burning. He tried to interject once. "She's just rehearsed, it's all memorized." But the words fell flat against the roar of approval. Every attempt he made to reassert control died before it could live. Finally, the waitress turned back to him. Her eyes were calm, her voice steady. "Respect," she said, her words clear enough for the entire room, "is the only universal currency." The line landed like a gavel. A hush fell for half a heartbeat, then the dining room exploded in applause. Diners rose from their seats, clapping, whistling, cheering. Some banged their palms against the tables in rhythm. Others shouted encouragement. "Bravo! Well said!" The French tourist's daughter clapped her little hands so hard she nearly knocked over her glass. The antagonist looked around desperately, but no one was with him anymore. The power he had flaunted, the authority he had abused, evaporated under the weight of her dignity. His arrogance had been exposed, and now he was just another man, revealed as petty, small, and ignorant. He stammered, I didn't mean," but the words were drowned beneath the ovation. The room had chosen its hero, and it wasn't him. The waitress gave a small bow of gratitude, then continued her work as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She refilled water glasses, smiled at guests, and carried trays with the same quiet elegance as before. That was the final blow. She hadn't performed for fame or applause. She had simply been herself, and that was enough to silence cruelty. Ilmer, the coroner, the billionaire who had been watching all along, set down his fork. His face betrayed no surprise, only satisfaction, as though he had been waiting for this moment. He pulled a small envelope from his pocket, scribbled something quickly, then folded it with care. Sliding it beneath his bill, he tapped the table once, signaling to himself that the decision was made. When the waitress eventually cleared his plates, she would find it. A handwritten note, and, tucked beside it, a jet ticket. But for now, the room belonged to her. The applause continued, rising and falling like waves. Guests smiled at her with newfound respect. Staff peeked out from the kitchen, grinning with pride. And the antagonist, once the loudest voice in the room, sat hunched and silent. His empire of arrogance crumbled at last. The roar of dignity had arrived, and no one would ever forget it. The applause rippled through the dining room long after the waitress stepped away from the antagonist's table. Diners leaned toward one another, whispering their disbelief. "Did you hear her? Fluent. In 3 languages. No, 4. Did you see his face when she shut him down?" The spotlight had shifted completely. Where once the room had giggled nervously at her expense, now the entire tide of admiration rolled in her favor. The antagonist sat slumped in his chair, cheeks red, jaw clenched tight. He glanced around the room, desperate to find an ally, but there were none left. Every smirk had turned into a frown of disgust or a pitying shake of the head. A table that had laughed at his jokes earlier now whispered openly about how pathetic he looked. The manager, once timid in his presence, avoided his eyes entirely. He had lost control, and worse, he had lost his audience. Meanwhile, the waitress moved quietly, gracefully. She continued serving as though nothing had changed, her dignity intact, her calm demeanor unshaken. Yet now, every tray she carried was followed by smiles. Every word she spoke was listened to with reverence. Guests leaned closer, eager to catch her voice, to be part of the moment they knew would be remembered. In the corner, the billionaire set his napkin on the table and rose to leave. He placed his bill inside the leather folder, but slid something. More beneath it, a sealed envelope. No one noticed but his dinner companion, who arched a brow as if to ask, "What are you doing?" The billionaire only gave a knowing smile and walked out quietly, unnoticed by the larger commotion. Later, when the room settled and she approached his table to clear the dishes, the waitress found the envelope. Curious, she slipped it into her apron until she had a moment alone. By the staff lockers, she unfolded it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. "Your brilliance is undeniable. The world is too big to waste behind a tray. I would like to offer you the chance to study abroad. All expenses covered. Enclosed is your first-class ticket. If you are willing, meet me in Paris. The rest will follow." Her hands trembled as she turned the envelope upside down and out. Slid the ticket. It was real, unmistakable. First class, one way, destination Paris. For a moment, the breath left her body. The same hands that had carried countless plates and scrubbed endless tables now held the key to the dream she had nurtured in silence for years. That night, long after the restaurant had closed and the chairs were stacked on tables, she called. Her mother. Her voice quivered as she explained everything, the insults, the reveal, the applause, and finally, the note and ticket. On the other end of the line, her mother listened quietly, letting her daughter's words spill out like a river long dammed. When she finished, there was a pause, heavy and full. Then her mother spoke, her voice warm and steady. "You didn't just serve a table, baby. You made them listen." Tears rolled silently down the waitress's cheeks as she clutched the phone. For all the applause and admiration she had received, that night nothing compared to the pride in her mother's voice. By morning, the story had already begun to spread. Clips of the incident flooded social media, posted by diners who had captured every moment. The antagonist's sneers, his demand that she kneel, his mocking tone, all of it was immortalized in pixels. But even more powerful were the clips of her responses, the fluid switch between French and Spanish, the Italian proverb, the symbolic line that echoed across feeds, "Respect is the only universal currency." Comment sections filled with outrage for him and awe for her. This man thought he was powerful, but she destroyed him with dignity. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Hire this woman for the UN right now. The antagonist, once confident in his untouchable status, found himself trending for all the wrong reasons. Articles branded him the snob who burned himself in public. Memes plastered his face with captions like, "When you realize you picked the wrong target." His humiliation had gone viral, cemented forever in the court of public opinion. Meanwhile, admiration for the waitress spread just as quickly. Strangers online called her an inspiration. Language schools offered scholarships. Organizations extended invitations. She was no longer invisible. She had become a symbol, and yet, through it all, she carried herself as she always had. Steady, humble, dignified. She hadn't raised her voice to win the crowd, nor begged for validation. She had simply spoken, and the truth had done the rest. The antagonist had sought to crush her spirit, but in the end, he had only elevated her. His downfall became her rise, and the entire world had witnessed the reversal. That night at the restaurant was more than an exchange of insults and applause. It was a shift in power, a reminder etched into every recording and every whisper. Arrogance will always collapse under the weight of dignity. And for the waitress, the daughter, the dreamer, the quiet force of brilliance, the journey was just beginning. Her story didn't end in the dining room. In truth, that night was just the beginning. The ticket in her apron pocket wasn't. Only a promise of travel. It was a key. She accepted the billionaire's invitation, stepping onto that first-class flight with trembling hands and a heart full of fire. What awaited her was not just Paris, but a future that had once seemed impossibly distant. Scholarships were arranged, mentors welcomed her, and soon she began training as a professional translator. What had been her private passion? Scribbled. Notes on napkins and whispered practice on late-night buses became her profession. From there, her path only climbed higher. Within a few short years, she was interpreting for diplomats, attending global summits, and bridging cultures with the same quiet grace she had once carried through a restaurant dining room. Eventually, she chose to return her success to others, founding a youth program dedicated to teaching languages and cultural awareness to children in working-class neighborhoods like the one she came from. She became more than a translator. She became a cultural ambassador, a symbol of what it meant to let dignity roar. The antagonist's story took the opposite path. His reputation was destroyed almost overnight. Clips of his arrogance circulated endlessly. His demand that she kneel. His scoffing dismissal of her intelligence. His sneers about her future. He became known not by his name, but by his humiliation. Social media dubbed him the man who lost to a waitress, and his face was memed across timelines worldwide. Job offers evaporated, invitations dried up, and his presence in any public space was greeted with whispers of ridicule. He was remembered not for his wealth, but for his downfall. Meanwhile, the restaurant where it all began also changed. Management realized that night had exposed something deeper. The way staff were too often treated as invisible. They instituted a new policy celebrating the hidden talents of their employees. Waitresses who painted had their art displayed on the walls. Busboys who played instruments performed during weekend brunches. Dishwashers taking night classes were supported with flexible schedules. Education programs were funded, mentorship was encouraged, and a plaque hung near the entrance with a line inspired by her words. Respect is the only universal currency. And then there was the viral wave. The video of the confrontation, clipped and subtitled in multiple languages, trended worldwide. Hashtags like "Our respect is the currency" and "Dignity wins" soared across platforms. News outlets replayed her words. Teachers used the clip in classrooms to talk about prejudice, dignity, and the hidden brilliance in every person. Youth groups invited her to speak, and she told them what her grandmother once told her. Dignity doesn't shout. It waits, and then it roars. In the end, the legacy of that night was bigger than one table, one restaurant, or one man's arrogance. It was a reminder, shared across millions of screens and countless hearts, that brilliance can live anywhere, in anyone, and that arrogance will always collapse when confronted by truth. She had once been invisible. Now, she was unforgettable, and the world would carry her lesson forward. Respect is the only universal currency. They mocked her for being a waitress, forgetting brilliance isn't hidden by an apron. To them, she was background noise, a servant in a uniform, someone to belittle for sport. Yet in one night, their arrogance collapsed, and her dignity soared higher than they could imagine. What they thought was humiliation became a stage, and what they dismissed as silence became her roar. The lesson was never about the languages she spoke, though they left the room breathless. It was about what those languages represented: knowledge, persistence, and the kind of brilliance that grows quietly until it can no longer be ignored. True power is not the ability to shame others. It is the knowledge that builds bridges across differences. True wealth is not measured in gold watches or expensive suits. It is measured in humility, in the respect you give freely, in the grace with which you carry yourself even when others would strip you of it. And true downfall, it is. Arrogance, unmasked before the world, revealed for the weakness it always was. The man who mocked her believed he held the room in his hand, but in reality, he burned his own reputation while she lit the path forward. Her story is not just hers. It belongs to anyone who has ever been underestimated, silenced, or overlooked. It is proof that hidden brilliance can turn the smallest stage into a revolution. If you believe hidden talents deserve to shine, no matter where they come from, share this story. Let the world see. Dignity and brilliance will always rise.